how have all those identities come together?
Yeah, it's interesting. Some of you may not know that the state where I live was actually the first state that shot down a constitutional amendment to ban same-sex marriage, and that was in 2012. Um, so within the business community during that time, it was fascinating because a lot of members of the community, the business community, would not step up and say, this is wrong. It's wrong for our employees if we ban same-sex marriage. It's wrong for our recruiting efforts. It's wrong for innovation. It's wrong for Minnesota. And so the company that I helped lead was the first Fortune 500 company to step up and say, we will stand against this hateful amendment that would ban same-sex marriage. And people in other companies would tell me, well, we get in a boardroom and everybody's concerned, and they said, how did your company come to this decision? And I said, well, my CEO's wife called my wife, and they basically said, you guys need to do this. So that's pretty much the entire conversation that happened at St. Jude around this. And then, of course, the rest of the story is Democrats took back the House, the Senate, we had the governor's mansion, and in the following year, we stepped forward and we, as a state, said marriage equality is important, and that we had marriage equality after that. So to me, the business community has an enormous role to play in this conversation, and frankly, is leading the way in many of your states that aren't quite ready from a political point of view. I see absolutely no dilemma in working for a progressive business organization and running for Congress as a progressive in this country. And I think, again, we look at our companies out there, a lot of them are ahead of our state legislatures, ahead of our states if you look around the country. And so I'm looking forward to making sure that I'm not just fighting for what's right in Minnesota, but making sure that things like the Equality Act become law across this country.
Thank you. Again, hearing the theme of representation in the C-suite, in every space, and having, you know, Angie and her wife there helping to create this environment where the company just said, oh yeah, we know Angie and we know Angie and Cheryl, and so, you know, of course we're going to come out against it. And David, you know, you've been representing the community. You were obviously the first openly elected state representative, and you made history, right, that night in your election in Florida. So, and you'd make history again if you were elected to Congress, first openly gay congressperson from Florida. So what was it like walking into the Florida House that day, knowing that you were the first to be elected, that you were walking in, and knowing that you were representing this community as you were going into that space?
So, and thank you for having us all here. It was quite an interesting experience because I won my election on the night of August 14, 2012, and became the first elected openly gay state legislator in the history of Florida, which is really incredible that it took that long. But and there were probably 100 news stories that were written about my win the next day. And there was one story that quoted a Republican who was already a legislator, and he said, you know, well, Mr. Richardson would be wise to come here and keep his mouth shut and his head down and just, you know, well, that didn't work out so well. But, you know, I was there for about 6 weeks before we ever went on the floor and doing our committee work, and I did a lot of business, so I tend to be very strategic and think about how I want to handle myself. So during those 6 weeks, I didn't mention the word gay. Everybody was sort of waiting for me to say something in committee, you know, and I didn't say the word gay. And I even had a couple of colleagues come to me, and, you know, it was like the big elephant in the room, and they would say things like, you know, what about the other issue? And I would say, what other issue, right? And I would make them say, you know, the gay thing. And I'm like, oh, you can say it out loud, you know? You can say it. So I didn't say, but then what happened is, quite by accident, because I don't set the agenda, one of the first bills they brought to the floor when we opened session was this complete rewrite of the foster care bill. And it was a motherhood and apple pie bill, and it was wonderful. And I had been working over the summer after I got elected on some issues about some LGBT and straight kids who had been abused in the foster care system. So I had already drafted an amendment to provide protections to LGBT youth. And so they put this bill literally the second day, I think, the second or third day of session. And so I put this amendment on that bill. And the person that was carrying it was a very conservative Republican, and he was very upset. And so I went and talked to him and told him how I would handle it. And I basically allowed that I would let it go to a voice vote as opposed to recording them. I thought that was a way of negotiating in a way. But it was the first time that there had ever been an LGBT debate on the floor house, and it happened right after I got there. And some people questioned my timing, but that's when the bill was brought. But the other thing is it sort of got the air out of the room, if you will, because then everybody got to talk about, But then I think many people thought every bill was going to have an LGBT amendment from me. And it didn't, although I thought that might be a good strategy if they're not willing to talk about things. But it's actually gone quite well. I think my approach has been to work very quietly in the back room. I have established really great relationships with the majority party, the Republicans. And I've also worked on issues that are not traditionally perhaps championed by the LGBT community. My work in prison reform and so forth has given me a voice in something that's completely unrelated to the LGBT community. And quite frankly, I'm working on perhaps 2 human rights programs or campaigns because, obviously I'm exposed a lot of corruption in the prison system. But what I realized as I was doing that work, people all over the state were starting to Google me and find out who I am and doing this work. And when they do that, of course, it came up that I'm an openly gay man. And so I think that has caused a lot of people who might not be friendly towards the community to sort of reevaluate for themselves, well, if he's going in and fixing this problem, maybe he's not so bad. So that's been very interesting.
Yeah, it sounds incredible. I mean, it's really true that when you're the only LGBT person in a particular space, that they're just waiting for you to do something gay, and just can be. That's why I always sing La Isla Bonita at the start of any meeting, just to
We'll start using
clear the air. All right, but that's great. Thank you so much, David. And Gina, I was wondering, I'm sorry, Angie. Sorry, I didn't mean to fake you out there. And I'd love if you could talk about a particular experience that you had navigating the court system. And this is a challenging story, but I know it's something you've talked about in the past, so I hope that you'll be willing to. And it's a case, I'll say, that I read in law school, though I obviously didn't know you at the time, and so, didn't see the human faces behind. Now that I know you and Cheryl, it resonates so much truer, a very difficult experience, and I wonder if you'd share it with us today.
Yeah, so when I was a new mom, my partner and I at the time, we adopted a young son. He was 4 days old when we met him, but in fact, his birth mom changed her mind because her parents decided they did not want their son to come home with lesbians. So we went home without our son, and 4 months later, she called us and said, "I can't do this. Will you take Josh still?" And at that moment in time, to be honest with you, I was 11 days pregnant. We decided to do artificial insemination after we lost Josh. And so, of course, we said yes to Josh. And then Jacob came along about a year later. And, but it was tough. We took him home, and his birth grandparents sued us for custody. So we already had the loss of losing him once, and then we had the loss of whether or not we were going to keep him. So, and I should back up and say this was in Tennessee, not Minnesota, in the late 1990s. And it was a really difficult time. I actually didn't talk about this story in my first run for Congress last cycle, but then a newspaper picked it up, and it's on my website right now if you want to read the whole story. But for 3 years in Tennessee, my partner and I, every single morning, woke up not knowing whether we would get to keep our son or not. This case, we won in Memphis, believe it or not. The birth grandparents appealed it to our Jackson Appellate Court, We won at the appellate level, which was fantastic. The dissent, if you read, is horrendous about what could happen to this child by being raised by two women. And then the birth grandparents took this to the Tennessee Supreme Court. So this actually is the case in the state of Tennessee, which establishes a lesbian's right to adopt. And some of you may know I ran for Congress in 2016, and I came up just over 1% short of winning this congressional seat in a tough cycle for Democrats. And so I'm coming back. That son is now a 20-year-old college sophomore. And if you ask him what it's like to have two moms, his answer will probably be something like, well, I didn't get away with much. But other than that, it was pretty good. So,
Thank you, Angie. I mean, and I encourage everyone to go